Okay, here we're seeing part two here, going into the myth of Osiris's symbolism, etc. If you haven't seen part one, then you should go to the end of this. In the last 30 seconds, it'll show up in your top left hand corner, and you can click on there and it'll show you part one. At the very end of it, again, this part here will show up in your top left hand corner. For those that were in part one, welcome back. So here we're looking at the end of the Book of the Dead drawn, or the Book of Coming Forth by Day. This is the book of a man that was known as Hunifer. And a few things to make of note. You can tell here that the gods here are drawn real pale, along with the women drawn real pale. Osiris is drawn green, and no, he's not a Martian. And but Hunifer in this depiction, and which is done after he's the weighing of the heart and before, and even in the smaller depiction up top, if you can see it here, where he's praying to all the gods, and here's the whole pantheon here that counts up. And if you'll look, this one here has blondish brown hair, and this one here has reddish blonde hair on it too. And so I wonder which exact name that those are being given. It's something I guess I need to look into too. But oh, what was I gonna say to? Oh, other interesting fact: the gods of Egypt. Did you know that they say the gods of Egypt had bones of iron and skin of gold? And you can look at the earliest pre-dynastic Nakata sculptures, and they've got these little statues that they had built with these blue inset eyes into them, and they're just wrapped in gold foil, and they're supposed to be like the gods. So it was the very first of effigies, and really doesn't look anything like the quality that comes right after. For some reason, they really get it kicking here. So, judgment scales, symbol of Ma'at, blah blah blah. Osiris seated under his canopy. Uh, this association with the underworld provides another explanation why Osiris is often depicted as a mummified pharaoh. Dead pharaohs were associated with him and mummified to look like him, and we're redoing that moment, supposedly. Kind of makes more sense now. A lot of people have never caught that part of it. Osiris is the agrarian god. Well, although it may seem contradictory at first, Osiris was also considered a fertility god, at least in terms of agricultural fruitfulness. But if you look at the agricultural cycle of apparent death and rebirth, you begin to see some of the reasoning behind this. For the ancient Egyptians, Osiris was symbolically killed and had his body broken on the threshing room floor of each harvest. Then the flooding of the Nile took place, and the land his body was revived once again. These factors can easily be likened to elements of the Osiris myth. And so, kind of like King Arthur, and he was the land, and the land was him. And every year he would spill out onto the land and cause fertility. And so he's taking the place kind of that Baal or Zeus or storm god situation with the rains, but it's associated again with the flooding of the Nile, and but it serves the same purpose, doesn't it? Right? In one agrarian ritual, a dirt figurine was created in a mold to represent Osiris, and it was placed in a small sarcophagus. Seeds were planted in the dirt, and when watered, creating an Osiris garden, or what some have called grain mummies, or corn mummies, corn being grain. When the plants grew from the box, it was said that the deity had been brought back to life. Some of these figurines, called Osiris beds in that context, have been found in the Theban tombs, where they have been found covered in the remains of wheat or barley. Tutankhamun's tomb provided archaeologists with some fine examples that were made of barley and emmer wheat. And here's an example of one, and hopefully you can kind of see the outline of the head and the crown that looks like the two plumes that are onto it here, and holding his effigy. And this just doesn't go all the way through. What this is like a bread mold. but instead of being a bread mold, it's a mold that they would put dirt into and then stick seeds into it. And a lot of people, this is like when you're a kid and you put beans in cotton inside a mason jar and set it in a windowsill, and they do this. And when they start perking up, of course, they would do this coming into the season, and this all heralded and everything, just like kids did with beans in the springtime. Osiris bed from 450 to 300 BC from Upper Egypt at Gabalat Garud, clay. The ancient Egyptians also had a legend stating that their people had been cannibals until Osiris and Isis taught them and then persuaded them to use the practice of agriculture instead. Although there is no strong evidence to say ancient Egyptians were ever cannibals, they seem to like the idea of Osiris having brought order to their civilization. And there is a couple of myths, and I've seen this before in going back onto it. And there was also a time that apparently there was such bad drought that something like this had happened before too. And not to go into it, but that also happened with other people sacrificing their children and things, trying to, in the hopes of rain and appeasing a god that you thought you had pissed off. It's a hell of a thing. Osiris symbols. The oldest found representation of Osiris date back to 2300 BC, but he didn't really become popular in images until the New Kingdom period in 1539 to 1075. Continuing with the agriculture connections, Osiris' body was sometimes represented as a field, and he was also linked to images of trees, which they didn't really have around there very much by then. A feature present in practically all the tombs, cenotaphs of Osiris. His skin color always shows the association. If it was green, it could represent the rebirth of vegetation, and if it was black, it was for the fertile soil of the Nile River Valley, in a Ka situation, waiting for the rebirth, or it was effectively that little dish that the kid or persons had planted it in and got it ready to go, and now we're only waiting on Ra to kick in, and it all happens like a magic. Voila! Here we see the Wadjet eyes and Osiris's weird carnival hat in this one here. Always thought that was neat, but there's some artistic difference through it. And what time was this? They even tell? No, it doesn't say. Osiris stands out from the most other famous Egyptian deities because he is depicted as human, not as an anthropomorphic or anthropomorphic or a human-animal crossed being. Most depictions of the god stress his role as the ruler of the underworld by showing him wrapped from the chest downwards in mummy bandages. And if not in the wrappings, he's shown in a tight-fitting garment. Voila. But a lot of times they'll just have red lines cross-hatching this thing like a lattice work, and that's the way they've done that secondary binding to it. As a king of Egypt, he was depicted with the Atef crown, a combination of the Hadjet, the crown of Upper Egypt, with an ostrich feather on each side. His power was shown in the crook and the flail in his hands, which were usually crossed in front of his chest, and these items represent the fertility of the land and the king's authority. Osiris is also shown wearing the long, curved, false beard of a dead god, and so that's reasons that they put on those beards, and you can see that long hooked beard that they had on him here, right? And another symbol of Osiris is the Jed Pillar. You've seen these before. In fact, some of them are pretty famous because people are thinking they're lighting up light bulbs. This symbolizes the stability and continuation of his power and represents his spine. The pillar is sometimes decorated with the Atef crown or two Wadjet or Ujat eyes. It also has been decorated with the flail and crook at times as well. This pillar was seen as an important feature in the ritually erected in some of the Abydos festivals. So they'd bring out a pillar and erect it during festivals. The raising of the Jed Pillar was a nod to the resurrection of Osiris, a stable monarch. And so it was a symbol like blessing the current pharaoh that was right there and saying, like, you know, hey, you've done so good that when it all happens, yeah, you know it. You can see everybody starting to cheer when they bring out something like this. And here you can see it that's here. And while you can see all the people in red ochre, you can see the females drawn extremely pale. And this is, again, that Caucasian edict where the females can stay pale, along with priests and so on. But all the people that are working are shown to be red ochre. And even though a lot of these people and kings weren't working, they want, like in the Book of the Dead that was just shown there, to have shown that they were working. I'm a man who did all this and did all that. Well, sometimes working doesn't involve having to move stones and so on if you're the king. It's good to be the king. And nobility and such, and people that are involved in other traits that are, or trades that don't have to do with it. It's a scene on the west wall of Osiris Hall that is situated beyond the 7 chapels and entered via the Osiris Chapel. It shows the raising of a Jed Pillar. The rise of Osiris cult and its rituals. By the way, people have said ostrich actually has something to do with this name, but I think somebody else gave etymology a different way. And just seeing that bulb sticking up off of it, that is his top of his hat there, reminded me of a ostrich egg. Abydos was the center of Osiris cult because of the ancient Egyptians believed the deity had been buried here. So whenever they chopped him up in all pieces, his head was buried there. So it was the head of the area. This city's necropolis was the most popular choice for a burial. If the person could afford it, it had a high enough status to be laid to rest near the deity. The next best option was placing a stele with the deceased's name near the site. And this necropolis is the necropolis, I believe, that they have dug up now. A bunch of the bodies, they say there's over 1 million there easy. But in the fact, there are blondes in one area, redheads in another, and dark-haired people in another. And it doesn't seem to be they're separated in family groups, but actually somewhat by hair. And that might insinuate which gods they worship and which ones they're under and part of, i.e., go from there. So now we'll take a look at him here, and there's something a little weird too on a lot of his shots. That snake, which is usually wrapped around and facing forward on his crown, is actually coming down his crown. And there's Osiris. And you can easily make out his Caucasian features for him here, but he still has that godly form to himself. But again, he also doesn't have that godly form, for this was a man that died and was resurrected again into a god, right? That's kind of familiar. Busiris, or known as Jedu, was another important Osiris sanctuary, and it is where one could see the name of the city written with 2 Jed pillars. A third key site for the followers of Osiris was Biga, or Sinmet. This small island was where Osiris's body is said to have rested, but the reach of Osiris cult was much wider, since all the cities which claimed to have been a location where a part of the dismembered body was buried also had a cenotaph to the god. And so there was almost like George Washington slept here. We had a piece of Osiris. And they're saying that at this one site, that small island, is where his body was apparently come to rest. But I don't think that's up in Phoenicia territory. I think that's right out there in the Gulf, in the Delta. Right there. Not where they say Phoenicians are. Of course, we've talked about Canaanites and that they call themselves Canaan. So this is the same situation all the way through. But the projected area it's supposed to be is way up, closer to Sidon than it would be down and around the corner and in the Delta area. But I believe Sinmet is down on the Delta. Although deceased kings were originally the only ones associated themselves with Osiris upon their deaths, by 2000 BC, every dead man could be linked to the deity. The association with Osiris signified not resurrection itself, but the renewal of life in the next world and through one's descendants. His popularity was cemented with the god's benevolent nature in the afterlife, as well as his role in creating order and law. People saw him as a god who could protect them during their lives and who would judge them fairly in the underworld or in the afterlife. And so that's kind of a different way of looking at than we normally look at things, right? Also, they started off by mentioning that at first nobody was really doing this and it was all about the king, but then the common man got to do it. They don't mention it in here, but there was a time too where all the king's servants were killed ceremoniously to go with him in the afterlife and still be there, but then they started differently looking at it to where everybody went, kind of in their own separate place a little bit, and all it took was Shabti dolls to make that same representation. In fact, they would bring a hell of a lot of Shabti dolls in certain situations. There's a lot of them in King Tut's. So, by making Osiris more accessible like this, he also became more popular and his cult spread throughout Egypt, sometimes with the god joining or absorbing other fertility and underworld deities. This ability to incorporate the local gods enabled Osiris worship to remain prominent through the Hellenistic and Roman periods. I've done a video about this that I'm about to talk about, but let's go. Serapis, for example, was a Hellenistic god that combined Osiris with Apis, the sacred bull of Memphis, which is in the delta, like Memphis, Tennessee, which is in the delta of a large river, the Hodding. Greco-Roman writers also saw connections between their god Dionysus, or Bacchus, and the Egyptian deity. Osiris only fell with rise of Christianity. I wonder why. But that hasn't stopped scholars from noting some similarities between that religion with the ancient Egyptian god story. Yeah, kinda Jesus, kinda Zeus, Jesus-ish, kinda, a little bit there. Yeah, that's that Serapis, 4th century BC. It was stored in the Serapeum of Alexandria. Although Osiris was the judge of the dead, he was also associated with rebirth, so the festivals related with him tended to focus more on celebrating life. This has already been noted with the Osiris figurines to enhance agricultural fertility. Processions and nocturnal rituals also took place at his temples, and aspects of his life, death, and rebirth were key elements of those rites, and a lot of them would be done at nighttime, in the dark of sun, to go along with the thing that's a cycle that happened every night. Osiris's death was honored at the festival of the Fall of the Nile, and his resurrection was celebrated in the Jed Pillar festival. The following section of a hymn to Osiris suggests just how popular his festivals and the god himself were to the ancient Egyptian people. And see if this doesn't sound familiar somewhat. Man, it's quite extensive. Unto thee are offerings made by all mankind, O thou Lord, to whom commemorations are made, both in heaven and in earth. Many are the shouts of joy that rise to thee at the Ak festival, 17th and 18th days of the month of Thoth, and cries of delight ascend to thee from the whole world with one voice. Thou art the chief and prince of thy brethren. Thou art the prince of company of the gods. Thou established right and truth everywhere. Thou placed thy son upon thy throne. Ding, thou art the object of praise of thy father, Seb, or Geb, and of the love of thy mother, Nut. Thou art exceedingly mighty. Thou overthrowest those who oppose thee, thou art mighty of hand, and thou slaughterest thine enemy. Thou settest thy fear in thy foe, thou removest his boundaries, thy heart is fixed, and thy feet are watchful. Thou art the heir of Seb, and the sovereign of all the earth. Thou hast made this earth by hand, and the waters thereof, and the wind thereof, and herb thereof, and the cattle thereof, and the winged fowl thereof, and the fish thereof, and all creeping things upon the earth thereof, and the four-footed beasts thereof. And boy, that's mimicking something I've heard before. Thou Son of Nut, the whole world is gratified when thou ascendeth thy father's throne like Ra. That's the sun god connection there. Thou shinest on the horizon, thou sendest forth thy light into the darkness. Thou makest the darkness light with thy double plume, and thou floodest the world with the light like the disk at the break of day or dawn. Thy diadem pierceth heaven, and become a brother unto the stars. O thou form of every god, thou art gracious in command and in speech. Thou art the favored one of the great company of the gods, and thou art the greatly beloved of the lesser company of the gods. So, pretty propped up there, but a lot of that sounds real familiar. And just short of a few phrases there, that'd fit in somebody else's book. And here we're looking at an early carving of somebody giving praise to, on the left, Osiris. Posthumous, after he's dead, stele of Amenhotep I and Ahmose Nefertari making an offering to Osiris, made of limestone, New Kingdom, Dynasty 18th. So this is during the 18th dynasty, Amenhotep, 1390 to 1352. Coming right through that time there that we were just talking about in the other videos. Another important aspect of Osiris worship was to present dramatic passion plays reflecting the life, death, mummification, and resurrection of the deity. That sounds kind of familiar too. The plays involve local priests and important community members, and the mock battles between the followers of Horus and the followers of Set were open to anyone. Some scenes were especially violent, and there even or cases noted of the stage violence having become real and leading to death. So, you know, fake swords and this, that, and another, but you hit somebody too hard and all of a sudden they freak out. and it's on. Man, this battle looks real this year. Once the battle was won by the followers of Horus, the festival goers celebrated by carrying out the golden statue of Horus from the temple's inner sanctum, just like was done with the statue of Tammuz in the Bible and how they tell you about that. But Dumuzi and the Sumerians in the same situation, signifying this same time and this same situation. And they would bring him out, though, so everyone could lavish him with gifts. It was then paraded around the city and finally placed in an outdoor shrine so the god could witness the festivities and people could admire him. This removal of the statue from the darkness of the temple also reflected an Osiris resurrection. Here's another statue of him, and we can clearly see who he is through that also, but same symbology carried through time. Pretty amazing. And so that's from the late period, Ptolemaic period statue of Osiris, but it looks no different from the other one that we were looking at and the others. And so There's a lot of connections that I've made, and if you've watched the other two videos about it, this is just cemented and made more connections. And if you weren't just, so hip or knowing about everything that went along with his myth, then you wouldn't be aware of how that came about and the whole idea about how his body parts went everywhere, or how somehow he ended up in a tree wrapped up in a pillar that nobody knew about, that she got the pillar and ta-da, and how that all comes out of that. It's kind of awkward, but most myths are somewhat are, but then again, that's why I said that other part about it. There is some truth into it. Could it be of any way, shape, or form that that's where they would get the cedars from, that they would make these statuettes of these cars out of? So are they just saying that they went and got this badass cedar for this dude and did the thing, and it brought back Osiris by making the Ka statue, and it was the first re-representation of him where they could set it into play where it all worked out in this 5th or 6th dynasty? Seems like that's a little bit more plausible or feasible. Let me know what you think down in the comments. Like, share, and subscribe if you haven't. Peace.